Good morning. Last December, Rosevilla's Green Team invited David Allaway to speak to our community. His talk was billed as too much stuff, which immediately caught my attention since I lean towards minimalism. What I did not expect was just how powerful his message would be. I was blown away, and I was not alone. The buzz afterward was that it was the best presentation we've heard at Rosevilla in years. As soon as it ended, I knew the SAFE community would really appreciate hearing David's perspective as well. You're in for a real treat today. I will now read David's most impressive biography. David Allaway has worked at the intersection of materials, environment, and waste for over 35 years. He currently works as a senior policy analyst at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, where his work is divided between policy development and impact assessment. David's work has been featured in publications such as Time and Sierra Magazine, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Grist, and the National Law Review, as well as PBS's Frontline, Vox's Consider It, and even last week, Tonight with John Oliver. He has testified before Congress and contributed to the New York Times bestseller, Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. David recently co-chaired the Oregon Recycling Steering Committee and helped to develop Oregon's Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act. He has received awards from the administrator of the US EPA and the American Center for Life Cycle Assessment. He has a BA in physics from Carleton College and lives in Portland with his wife and two kids. I look forward to David's presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. That was a very kind introduction, especially the part about how my presentation was received at Roseville. I appreciated the invitation there, and I appreciate the invitation to meet with all of you this morning. So I'm here to talk about stuff. Stuff. The stuff that comes out of factories, the stuff in our stores, the stuff in our homes, and the environmental impacts of all of this stuff, and how to reduce those environmental impacts. As Ed said, I work at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality. And in my program at DEQ, we have a more formal name for stuff. We call it materials. And the program I work in is called DEQ's Materials Management Program. So I'm in the Materials Management Program. We used to be called the Solid Waste Program. And for decades, we managed landfills and recycling policy. But about 20 years ago, we started discovering that when it comes to the environment, materials have a lot of big impacts besides just the impacts of waste or garbage. And when it comes to protecting the environment, regulating landfills and improving recycling is important, but it is insufficient. And that's the story I'd like to share with you briefly today. My story is deeply informed by my work for the state of Oregon, but I think that wherever you are in the country, you'll find most of what I share today relevant, regardless of where you live. We all like to think that our states are different or special, and every state is different and special. But when it comes to our economy and the general orientation or organization of society and how we impact the environment, we have much more in common. So let's talk about environmental impacts. This is the senior stewards acting for the environment. I presume you're all here because you're motivated out of some concern for the environment. Those concerns might be very broad, wide-ranging. Some of you might care about climate change. Some of you might care more about plastic pollution. You might be motivated more by the pollinator crisis, or extinction of species, or depletion of fresh water, or toxics, resource depletion, forests, whatever environmental issue it is that motivates you, materials have profound impacts there. Today, I'm going to focus primarily on climate, not to suggest that climate is the only impact we care about, but through the lens of climate, we can evaluate and we can quantify environmental impacts and tell an interesting story. So How do we as individuals or as an entire state contribute to climate change? At the state level, policymakers and advocates answer this question through a process known as a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. And as the name implies, it's just an accounting of greenhouse gas emissions. And every state follows basically the same accounting protocol, which is to draw a line around the state's borders and add up all the emissions that physically originate within the state's borders. And that makes sense if the only tool in your toolbox is to regulate sources of emissions within your state. Many states, like Oregon, also account for the emissions of the electricity that we use in our state, even if the electricity is produced somewhere else. And that also makes sense as states are able to regulate electricity sales. So what's missing from that perspective? Well, obviously, what's missing, if you think about it, are the impacts of all the materials that we use in our states that are produced in other states or nations. And you might wonder, is that a small omission or a large omission? To answer that question, many years ago, Oregon commissioned the first consumption-based emissions inventory, which is a different way of inventorying emissions with a different set of accounting rules. And in the consumption-based emissions inventory, what we do is we start with consumption, the purchase of goods and services by households, governments, and businesses, and we trace the emissions that result from that consumption throughout the world. And here is a high-level overview from 2021 of how Oregon's traditional sector-based inventory and the consumption-based inventory compare. You'll see on the screen two overlapping circles. There's a circle that is orange and green on the left, and there's an overlapping circle that is green and blue on the right. The smaller colored circle is the state's sector-based inventory at 61 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. The larger circle on the right is the new consumption-based inventory at almost 96 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions. The circles overlap. There are many emissions that are common to both inventories, such as the emissions from people driving cars and heating their homes. The orange crescent on the left are emissions that are unique to the sector-based inventory. Examples of these would be emissions from industry in Oregon that are burning energy to produce goods and agricultural products that are sold to other states. The large blue crescent on the right are global emissions occurring in other states or nations as a result of satisfying consumption in Oregon. And this is important because consumption is the root driver of all economic activity. Businesses don't make things if people aren't buying them, right? So if every state only conducted a sector-based inventory, which is mostly the case, you would only see the emissions in the smaller circle. The consumption-based inventory for Oregon brings in an additional 59 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions that otherwise would be ignored or not accounted for. And that's almost as large as the entire sector-based inventory itself. So basically, this broader view of the world, and I think it's both holistic and it's also a very rational view of the world, almost doubles our understanding of how Oregon contributes to emissions, and by extension, opportunities to reduce those emissions. And that's why this is so important. We don't do inventories because we like to do accounting. We do inventories for the purpose of informing and inspiring climate policy and climate programs. And so when we understand the full impact of how we contribute to climate change as a state, we can activate more solutions to reduce those impacts. Those overlapping circles were for a single point in time, 2021. This graph shows how the two inventories compare over time. going back to 1990. The green triangles are the state's sector-based inventory. The blue circles are the consumption-based inventory. And here, there's a clear divergence. Back in 1990, the two inventories were very close to each other. They both rose throughout the 1990s. And then starting around 2000, Oregon began really focusing and implementing policies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as we understood them, which at the time were limited to the sector-based inventory. And these conventional climate policies and programs, such as energy conservation and fuel standards, have caused the sector-based inventory to start to turn down, even as our population and economy have grown. So there's great proof here in the green line that when a state chooses to prioritize and focus on greenhouse gas emissions, we can be successful. Unfortunately, during the same time period, very few people were aware of consumption-based emissions. There was essentially no policy or program or very little programmatic focus on them, and those emissions have risen unabated. So clearly, there's a lot more that could be done here. Just to take a closer look at what these consumption-based emissions are, again, now we're looking at 2021 again. This chart breaks the state's consumption-based emissions into 16 different categories. Let me briefly explain the colors on these charts. The purple lines are emissions that occur upstream of the consumer, emissions in extracting raw materials and manufacturing products. The kind of teal or turquoise colored bars are the emissions that occur from using products. And there's a couple of very, very small lime green bars that are emissions from disposal. So, for example, if you look at vehicles and parts, most of the emissions are a consequence of driving the vehicles. Those are the tailpipe emissions as the cars, burn gasoline. But there are some pretty significant emissions associated with making the vehicles in the first place, with manufacturing them. That's the purple bar. And if you compare that purple bar for vehicles and parts with lighting and fixtures down towards the bottom, we actually discovered that the emissions associated with manufacturing cars that are purchased in Oregon are larger than all of the emissions associated with using lighting in the state. The next largest category of emissions is food and beverages. And almost all of those emissions are on farms and fields and factories. There's a tiny amount of emissions associated with disposal of food. And you can go on down the list and see how consumption, what types of consumption contribute the most to greenhouse gas emissions. My last chart from this study takes all those emissions and clusters them into four kind of major categories: electricity, fuels, services, and materials. And what I want to point out here is that between 2005 and 2021, Oregon's contribution to emissions from consumption of electricity and fuels have gone down, both as a percentage of the total and in absolute terms. Again, our state has been focused on implementing policies to reduce emissions from fuels and electricity. Hooray, we are making progress. At the same time, we have not paid much attention to the emissions associated with all the materials we consume. And not surprisingly, those emissions have grown unabated and are now 48% of our total global emissions profile. So materials matter. What can we do about these emissions? Well, there are several different types of solutions, and I'm going to begin with one family of solutions that we all know. It is a mantra we have been repeating for decades as a society, and that is reduce, reuse, recycle. Now, reduce, reuse, recycle is an idea that was promulgated by the US EPA in the 1980s, and it was intended to be a hierarchy of options to be implemented in rank preferred order. Reducing is better than reusing, and reusing is better than recycling. Unfortunately, over the years, the hierarchy was co-opted and flipped on its head to mean recycle, 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 and very few policymakers paid any attention to reduce. And that was a tragedy. I want to share an example that graphically illustrates why reduce and reuse are so much more important than recycling. And the example comes from a study that we conducted about 10 years ago called a life cycle assessment. And this study quantified the environmental impacts of different methods of delivering drinking water. So on this chart here, I'm comparing two different methods of delivering drinking water across 5 different types of environmental impacts: global warming potential, energy use, the release of toxics that cause cancer, respiratory effects, such as pollutants that cause asthma, and then ecotoxicity, which is a measure of pollutants that affect, salmon and salamanders, invertebrates, lower down in the food chain. The blue bars on this graph show the relative impacts across the entire life cycle. And by life cycle, I mean extracting the natural gas, getting it to a refinery, cracking it, producing ethylene, converting the ethylene to polyethylene terephthalate, making the bottle, filtering the water, filling the bottle, putting it in a box, shipping it to a store. All these impacts, we add them all up. The only difference between these two scenarios is that in blue, 37% of the bottles get recycled, and in red, 62% get recycled. Why these numbers? Well, it just so happens that right before we did the study, plastic water bottles were added to Oregon's bottle bill. We are one of 10 states that has a deposit on beverage containers. So if you buy beverage containers at the store, you pay a deposit, and you get your deposit refunded to you when you return them to a recycling center. And before water bottles were in the bottle bill, about 37% of them statewide were recycled. And after they were added to the bottle bill, the rate jumped up to 62%. So you can see that as you recycle more bottles, the environmental impacts of those bottles go down, although by a very small amount. And if that's all we can do is to recycle, we're not going to move the needle enough. Fortunately, there are some other actions higher up in this hierarchy involving reduce and reuse. Manufacturers of bottled water in recent years have found ways to make the bottles very thin so that they use much less plastic. That is a form of reduce. And the environmental impacts of these thinner, lightweight bottles are shown in green. We as individuals can also engage in reduce and reuse by not drinking bottled water and instead drinking out of a reusable bottle, such as the one I'm holding up here. And one estimate of the environmental impacts of that are shown in aqua. We label this the worst case tap water scenario because what this involves, we assumed that an individual would fill their bottle from the tap, drink out of it, and at the end of the day, they would put their bottle in the dishwasher and run the dishwasher every single day. And not only that, but we assumed a worst case scenario where this dishwasher in this person's home is the worst energy and water consuming dishwasher that has ever been sold in the United States in the last 40 years. The dishwasher, which by the greatest margin ever failed to qualify for the EPA Energy Star label. Now, in contrast, if you're like me, I actually don't wash these even once a week. But if you did wash your bottle once a week in a dishwasher, and the dishwasher was an Energy Star labeled dishwasher, so it used relatively little energy and water, the environmental impacts of that would be shown in orange. And if you can't see the orange, it's there, squint, it's almost zero. And I share this, and I have many other case studies like this that demonstrate why reducing and reusing are so much more important than recycling. But let's talk about recycling for a minute. And one of the biggest problems in recycling today is a problem that we refer to as contamination. Contamination is what occurs when people put stuff in the recycling bin that they wish they could recycle, but actually can't be recycled. In Oregon, contamination in the 2010s became such a problem that local domestic paper mills that used to buy this paper started turning recycling away. And in some cases, they closed their doors because it was too expensive for them to deal with all the garbage that was coming into their paper mills. For a while, this didn't disrupt things because China was eager to acquire raw materials, and they tolerated the contamination and sort of vacuumed up basically all the recyclables coming off of the West Coast. But eventually, China also became concerned with the problem of contamination. In 2017, there was a movie that aired throughout China called Plastic China, which exposed the terrible, terrible social, environmental, and health consequences of all of this plastic garbage that was being dumped in China um, as a consequence of the world's recycling system. Sorry, my 5-year-old is on his way to school, so bye-bye. Okay. Um, so China banned the imports of all these recyclables, and they just started going to other places. The pictures I'm about to share with you were taken in East Java, Indonesia. And these pictures, these piles and mountains of plastic dumped in these villages and in the countryside, were actually not dumped there as a consequence of plastics recycling. This was a consequence of paper recycling and the fact that our country largely recycles materials in a commingled fashion. You put your plastic and your paper and your metal, and in some communities, your glass, all in the same bin. And these materials go to processing facilities that sort out the materials that maybe they don't do as good of a job as they should. So what was happening here is that processing facilities in North America were trying to sort out these mixed recyclables, shipping bales of paper, air quote, paper, to Indonesia, selling them to a paper mill. The paper mill would dump the bales of paper into their machinery, screen out the plastics, and then dump the plastics in the countryside to be picked through, burned, and eventually washed into rivers and streams and the ocean. This is not a failure of plastics recycling. This is a failure of recycling writ large. It is a failure of a consequence of our nation not regulating processing facilities and not regulating the export of recyclables. So Oregon's response to this problem was to pass a law called the Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act. And 6 other states have passed similar laws in the last few years that intend to overhaul the recycling system and bring in producer responsibility, where producers that make these materials are obligated to share in the financial responsibility of fixing the problem. And this policy framework is called extended producer responsibility. Each of the 7 states have very different laws, but some things in common. In Oregon's law, it's a whole system reform that changes how recyclables are collected, it changes how they're processed, and it requires, for the first time, full reporting of where everything goes, disposition, and it requires that these materials only go to places that are certified or verified as responsible in markets. And again, the system improvements will be paid for in part by fees assessed on the producers of packaging, food serviceware, and printing and writing paper, thereby hopefully providing some incentive to them to stop contributing to this problem. I could talk for hours about the recycling elements of this act, but I actually want to focus on 2 other elements that I think are potentially as maybe more important. The first is a program called eco-modulation, which is a fancy term that comes to us from Europe. It basically means that in this system, producers, companies like Amazon and General Mills and L'Oreal, they are paying fees to support this program. They can get a fee reduction if they take specific actions to reduce environmental impacts. And in our law, one of the actions that they can take is to evaluate and publicly disclose the full life cycle environmental impacts of their products. And this is very important because at present, companies are making all sorts of claims. We're compostable, we're eco-groovy, we're recyclable, we're eco-friendly, with no consideration given to the actual environmental consequences. So this law creates accounting standards for disclosure and assessment and disclosure of impacts, and says if you want to assess and disclose impacts, you can get a fee reduction. And this is important because experience shows that when companies publicly disclose their impacts, they are much more likely to reduce the impacts first. There's an old analogy that people used to say, you don't hang up your dirty laundry, right? You wash your laundry before you hang it up. Um, and so this is, sort of a similar principle. The law also has an impact reduction program where some of the funds will go to support programs such as reuse. For example, getting disposable dishware out of school cafeterias and getting disposable, dishware out of restaurants, etc. So I only have a few minutes left here, and I don't want to give you the impression that packaging is the only thing that matters, because it doesn't. This graph here shows the average carbon footprint for a variety of foods, and the green portions of the bar is the contribution of packaging. The blue portion of the bar is the contribution of processing, like manufacturing, and the orange portion of the bar are emissions from farms and fields and ranches. So, although we all intuitively gravitate towards packaging as the problem, when you look at the impact of materials through a climate lens, packaging is not the problem. It's the products in the packaging that are the problem. So food is very impactful, and there are many opportunities to reduce those impacts. And that is confirmed through our consumption-based emissions inventory, where food is the second highest contributor to our emissions. Another category I want to talk about for a couple minutes is construction, and a concept of embodied carbon. Before I get there, however, let me briefly mention that Oregon is in the process of preparing a comprehensive climate action plan. This has not been published yet. It will come out in a month or so. And as part of this planning effort, we are evaluating the greenhouse gas reduction potential of 50 or so different actions the state could take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And on this chart here, I am showing you 4 of those actions. The first involves controlling methane emissions from landfills. The second is improvements to the recycling system. The third is to expand composting to compost more food waste. And the fourth is to prevent the wasting of food, to waste less food at the source. And the height of these bars shows our projection of how many greenhouse gases we think we could reduce over the next 25 years through implementing these programs. Here are 3 other measures. The first would be a modest nudge to get people to increase their consumption of plants and reduce their consumption of meats. The second is this upstream packaging EPR that I was telling you about, how these 2 elements of our law move beyond recycling and start getting producers to change the way they make packaging. And finally, the big granddaddy of all of these is to reduce embodied carbon. We think this actually has the most potential, and this is about building materials. And what I just want to focus your attention on is that if you view this problem as a solid waste problem, and it's a problem of garbage, and the solution is to follow the hierarchy to reduce, reuse, recycle, then it's going to activate the solutions on the left side of the screen. If you view this problem as a problem of materials writ large and the production and consumption of materials, then it can activate solutions across the entire screen, including the solutions that are larger and more impactful. So let's talk just for a couple minutes about embodied carbon. Embodied carbon refers to the greenhouse gas emissions that result from the manufacturer, primarily the manufacturer, but also the transportation and installation of building materials, concrete, steel, wood, roofing, carpets, etc. And the opportunities to reduce embodied carbon include both using lower carbon materials. You can like substitute one material for another, or even within the same family of materials, you could find a lower carbon concrete as opposed to a higher carbon concrete. A different way to reduce embodied carbon is just to use fewer materials. For example, something we call adaptive reuse of existing buildings, where you take an existing building that might be vacant and you repurpose it rather than tearing it down and building a new one. Uh, you can also change material use through design. So I'm very excited to share here a program we're currently rolling out called the Low Embodied Carbon Housing Program. It's funded by a $25 million grant from the US EPA that was granted to Oregon in the waning days of the last presidential administration. These funds have not been impounded by the current administration, so we are moving forward with this program. And what we're doing with this program is offering financial incentives to building owners and developers to implement either of two strategies. The first strategy is called reuse, and it involves converting existing non-residential buildings to new housing. And this is important. If you look at downtown Portland, Oregon, 30% of pre-COVID office space is sitting vacant. If you go to what we call Main Street communities, smaller communities with populations of 10 to 50 or 70,000 across the state, and you go into their downtowns, um, typically there's a lot of 2 to 3 story buildings in the downtown areas. The first stories are mostly occupied, but 50% of all the commercial space on the second floor and above in these Main Street communities is vacant. And at the same time, we have a serious houselessness population here and a lack of affordable housing. So the idea here is to provide there are reasons why this space is sitting vacant, right? It's not easy or cheap to convert it to housing. Our hypothesis is it's not easy or cheap, but it might be cheaper than building more and more suburbs and laying more and more infrastructure and more roads and more sewer pipes and more of all of that, and forcing people to live far away from things and burdening them with high transportation costs. It'd be better to build up as opposed to out. So we're offering financial incentives to developers to try to help them to convert some of these buildings. The second strategy we call space efficient housing, and this focuses more on existing residential houses. As an example, the neighborhood that I live very close to, very nice neighborhood in Portland called Laurelhurst. It was built in the 1920s at a time when the average household had like 5 people in it. The houses are lovely, they're large, they're beautiful, but the average household in Oregon today has 2 people in it. And across our state, there are more than 1.5 million bedrooms that nobody sleeps in. Even as we have more than, I don't know, 100,000 people sleeping outside on the streets. So what we did in our house a couple years ago is we took our basement and we converted part of it into an apartment. And there's lots of potential for this throughout our state. And so strategy 2 here provides financial incentives to encourage more homeowners to do the same. This project also includes a requirement that any new materials you use in these remodeling projects also have to reduce embodied carbon by 10%. So I just share this with you as an opportunity, an area that I think has a lot of opportunity. And here's the map of the 9 communities where these financial incentives are being offered. I'm just going to wrap this up and say that the consumption-based view of emissions uncovers lots of important opportunities for environmental protection. And these are opportunities that most policymakers, until very recently, have been very slow to recognize, because the sector-based inventory has put some blinders on people where they're only seeing part of the problem. And the consumption-based inventory takes those blinders off and helps them see more emissions and more opportunities. And this is important. Environmental impacts do not respect state borders. Capital increasingly moves across state borders. Consumer spending moves across state borders. And so for all these reasons, it's helpful to view these environmental challenges as global phenomena. The emissions might occur in some other state or some other country, but there are opportunities to reduce those emissions here in our states, in our homes, in our communities. And as I've illustrated from these examples, individual consumption drives a lot of impacts, but it can be difficult for individual consumers to reduce those impacts by ourselves because sometimes sustainable consumption is not easy. Sometimes the options aren't available. Sometimes they're too expensive. Sometimes they're too time consuming or they're confusing. And so our approach is to think that there may be better opportunities rather than going out and asking everyone to change their behavior. It might be better to just sort of change the rules of the game to just remove some of the bad options from the marketplace and make it easier, more affordable, and more convenient, more automatic for people to just make good choices. And so with that, I'm going to stop my presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to some discussion.